Winter, 1944. The Apennine Mountains. For the men of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, this was not war, it was survival. The enemy was not just the German 148th Division, dug into concrete bunkers on the peaks above. The enemy was the mountain itself. The enemy was the mud, a thick, freezing, relentless paste that swallowed boots, trucks, and hope. And the enemy was the snow, falling in heavy, wet sheets, burying the landscape in a cold, white death. This was the Gothic Line, and the Brazilians were assigned to its most brutal sector. Their objective was a series of mountain peaks: Monte Castelo, La Serra, Soprasasso. These were not just hills. They were the eyes of the German army. From these peaks, German artillery observers could see every road, every valley, every movement, 4 miles. As long as the Germans held these impossible peaks, no Allied advance was possible. The war in Italy was frozen in place. So the Brazilians did the impossible. In a series of bloody, agonizing assaults, they climbed, they fought hand to hand in the dark. They clawed their way up the ice-licked rock faces, and they took the peaks. They captured the German observation posts. But victory created a new, desperate problem. A peak that is difficult to attack is also difficult to defend. The Brazilians had taken the high ground, but now they were isolated, cut off. Islands of men floating in a sea of snow, connected to the world by one single, treacherous goat path. And this is where our story begins. Not with a battle, but with logistics. Because an army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach, the heroes on the peak could not fight without bullets. They could not survive the sub-zero nights without food and dry socks. They could not call in artillery without fresh batteries for their radios. The resupply of these peaks was not just important, it was the single most critical mission of the entire front. If the supply line failed, the men on the peak would be forced to surrender or freeze to death. The entire victory would be for nothing. The job fell, naturally, to the experts. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, attached to the FEB's division. The Americans were the greatest logisticians in the world. They had mastered the science of supply. They had tractors, bulldozers, and thousands of Willys Jeeps. They looked at the problem of the impossible peak and applied their doctrine. Mechanized power. They tried the Jeeps. The Jeeps, those miracles of American engineering, were useless. The goat path was not a road. It was a 45-degree slope of mud and shattered rock. The Jeeps burned out their clutches, broke their axles, or slid off the path and tumbled into the ravines below. The mechanized solution had failed. So the Americans fell back on the next logical step. Standard issue pack animals. The U.S. Army had its own mule companies. They were trained at camps in Colorado. They were led by officers who had read the manuals. They knew the regulations for how to load a mule. They loaded their animals and began the ascent. It was a disaster. The path was slick with ice. The mules, laden with heavy boxers of ammunition and balanced precariously, would slip. A 500-pound animal falling on a narrow path creates a catastrophic bottleneck. The other mules would panic. Then, the German artillery THOI observers on the next mountain over would see the bottleneck. They would register the coordinates, and the shells would begin to fall. The American-led mule teams were torn apart. The animals, terrified by the explosions, would rear up, scattering their precious cargo of food and batteries down the mountainside. They would break their legs. They would have to be shot. The path became a graveyard of animals and equipment. The U.S. Army logisticians, masters of a global supply chain, were defeated by a single, muddy hill. They reported back to headquarters. The route was impossible. The peak could not be reached. It was, by their official estimation, a lost cause. Back at the Brazilian command post, the mood was grim. The radio calls from the peak were growing desperate. No food for 24 hours. Radio batteries. Critical. Send morphine. The officers were facing a horrifying reality. They would have to order their men to abandon the peak they had just sacrificed so many lives to win. And it was in this moment of total failure, as the officers and their American advisors stared at their maps, that a man stepped forward. He was not an officer. He was not a logistician. He was a prasinha, a private, or maybe a corporal, a man from the mountains of Minas Gerais or the backcountry of the Sur. A man who, in civilian life, was not a soldier. He was a Tropeiro, an old Welsh Muleteer, a man who had spent his entire life walking beside mules, living with them, breathing the same air as them. He had been watching the American teams fail, and he finally spoke up. He probably said it quietly, without arrogance. Com licença, meu capitão. Excuse me, capitão. You are doing it all wrong. The Brazilian officers and their American advisors looked at this soldier. He was probably older than the others, his skin weathered like leather, his eyes quiet and observant. He wore the same uniform, but he was different. He was a man who understood mountains, not as obstacles on a map, but as a place to live. He was a tropeiro, a mule driver. In his civilian life in Brazil, he didn't use jeeps. He didn't have railroads. Muleteer Trick. His entire livelihood depended on loading these stubborn, intelligent animals with coffee, with tools, with supplies, and leading them over the Serra do Mar, or through the high plains of Minas Gerais. Routes just as treacherous as the one in front of him. He knew something the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, with all their manuals, did not. He knew the soul of a mule. The Americans treated the mule like a piece of equipment, a four-legged jeep. They followed their regulations, which dictated that supplies be loaded in rigid, standardized wooden crates. They balanced the weight perfectly. 100 pounds on the left, 100 pounds on the right. It was efficient. It was logical. And it was killing the animals. The tropeiro could see the problem from a mile away. The rigid boxers sat high on the mule's back, on a flat road. This was fine, but on a 45-degree, ice-covered goat path, it was a disaster. The high, rigid center of gravity made the mule top a V. Every time the animal slipped, the weight of the boxers would shift, throwing it off balance and sending it tumbling into the ravine. Furthermore, the wooden crates would scrape against the narrow rock walls of the path, panicking the animal. And when the artillery shells began to fall, the mules, terrified by the sound and trapped by their rigid loads, would rear up and lose their footing. The Brazilian soldier explained this. He probably didn't use terms like center of gravity or logistical failure. He spoke in the simple, direct language of his trade. Meu capitão, he might have said, the load is wrong. It's too hard. It's too high. You're fighting the mule. You have to work with him. A mule is not a truck. He is a partner. He needs to feel the load. He needs to be able to shift it, to balance himself. He needs to trust you. He laid out his plan, and it was pure, simple, ingenious. It was the old muleteer's trick. First, he told them, get rid of the boxers. The officers were horrified. The ammunition was packed. The radio batteries were sealed. These were standard-issue containers. The tropeiro didn't care. He asked for burlap sacks, canvas tarps, blankets, anything soft. His team, a small group of fellow Pracinhas, who also came from the fazendas and the backcountry, set to work. They broke open the army-issue crates with bayonets and axes. They took the heavy, dense supplies boxes of .30 calibre ammunition, heavy radio batteries, tins of rations, medical supplies, and they began to reap. They didn't pack for efficiency. They packed for balance. They wrapped the hard objects in blankets to stop them from jabbing the animal's ribs. They distributed the ammunition into smaller cloth bags. They created two large, soft-sided bundles, like saddlebags. This was the first part of the hack. The load was no longer high and rigid. It was low-slung, flexible, and conformed to the mule's body. When the mule moved, the soft load would move with it, not against it. But the second part of the hack was even more important. It was about psychology. The tropeiro looked at the American mule line, where each animal was tied to the one in front of it, a long, vulnerable chain. This was standard military procedure. It was also, as the tropeiro knew, incredibly stupid. You cannot tie them like that, he explained. When one panics, they all panic. The rope becomes a death sentence. Each mule must be free, and each mule needs a leader. So, he selected his team. Not just the men, but the animals. He walked among the mules, survivors of the American disaster. He looked in their eyes. He chose the calmest, the oldest, the most intelligent animal. This one, he decided, would be the madrinha, the godmother. He would hang a bell around her neck. The other mules, instinctively, would follow the sound of that bell. It was a sound they associated with safety, with their herd. Finally, the tropeiro and his team took their own rucksacks and filled them with rocks. The officers stared. Were these men insane? You have to lead them, the tropeiro said. The mule will not go where a man is afraid to go. But if he sees you walking ahead, walking with a heavy load just like him, he will trust you. He will follow. They were not just mule drivers. They were leaders of mules. The skeptical officers, faced with the desperation of their men on the peak, had no other choice. The American logisticians had failed. The manuals had failed. The peak was dying. The captain looked at this dusty, weathered soldier. "God help you, Private," he said. "Get them the supplies." The Tropeiro simply nodded. He put his hand on the lead mule's neck, whispered something in her ear, and began to walk. The mission was on. The ascent began. It was a completely different picture from the American attempt. There was no long, chaotic chain of animals. There was a small, tight team. At the front was the Tropeiro himself, his rucksack heavy with rocks, walking with a steady, unhurried pace. He wasn't forcing the pace. He was letting the lead mule, the madrinha, set it. Behind him, the bell on the madrinha's neck created a steady, rhythmic clink, clink, clink. It was a tiny sound in the vast, hostile mountains, a beacon of calm in the middle of a war. Following the sound of the bell, the other mules walked in a loose, single file. They were not tied. Each animal was free to choose its own footing, to pause, to balance itself. Their loads, packed low and soft in the burlap sacks, shifted with their muscles, hugging their bodies. And beside each mule walked another prosinha, another back-on-tree, his own pack heavy, one hand gently resting on the animal's harness, speaking to Italiano. They weren't shouting commands. They were murmuring soft words in Portuguese. "Calma, garoto, devagar. Estamos chegando. Easy, boy, slow." We're almost there. They were not soldiers driving equipment. They were a family of farmers moving their herd. They were a single, organic unit, man and animal, moving with a shared purpose. The path was just as slick. The 45-degree slope was just as steep. The ice was just as treacherous. But when a mule slipped, which it inevitably did, the scene was entirely different. The animal would slide, its hooves scraping for purchase. But its load, low and flexible, wouldn't throw it off balance. The Tropeiro beside it wouldn't panic or whip the animal. He would simply stand firm, brace himself, and speak to the mule. "Calma, calma, double quotes the mule, trusting the man and unburdened by a rigid, high-strung low, would find its footing, shake itself off, and continue the ascent, drawn forward by the sound of the bell. Then the inevitable happened. An enemy observer on a neighboring peak, sweeping the mountainside with his binoculars, saw them. He saw the movement. A line of men and animals on the impossible path. His radio operator would have barked the coordinates. The German artillery battery, the dreaded 105mm howitzers, received the fire mission. The calculations were made, and the shells came. They came in with a terrifying, ripping sound, like a freight train in the sky, before exploding on the mountainside. Boom, boom, boom. Fountains of rock, mud, and steel erupted around the supply train. This was the moment the American teams had disintegrated. This was the moment of pure, primal panic. The mules would have reared, screaming, breaking their tethers, scattering their loads. But the Tropeiro's mules did not. The lead Tropeiro didn't even flinch. He never broke his stride. He just kept walking, one steady step after another. Izond on to madrinha. The bell clink, clink, never stopped. It was the only sound of sanity in a world of explosions. The other Tropeiros did the same. They moved closer to their animals, pressing their bodies against the mules, shielding them, absorbing their fear. They spoke to them. "Calma, calma. É só barulho. It's just noisy. Stay calm, double quotes." The mules, terrified by the explosions, looked for an anchor. They didn't have ropes tying them to other panicking animals. They had two things: the calm, steady clink of the lead mule's bell in front of them, and the calm, steady hand of a man they trusted beside them. Their herd instincts took over. Their leader, the madrinha, was not running. The man beside them was not running. So they did not run. They flinched. They shuddered. But they kept walking. They put one hoof in front of the other, their heads down, following the sound of the bell through the smoke and fire. The German artillery officer must have been furious. He was firing a full battery at a column of mules, and they would not scatter. He was wasting hundreds of pounds of high explosives on animals that simply kept walking. He corrected his aim. The shells landed closer. A huge explosion erupted just 10 meters from the path, showering the team in rocks. One mule was hit. It went down. This was the ultimate test. In the American column, this would have been a catastrophe. The chain reaction of panic would have destroyed the entire line. But here, the Tropeiro's system kicked in. The other animals, untethered, simply walked around their fallen comrade. The Tropeiro assigned to that mule, seeing his animal was mortally wounded, did the necessary, terribly work. He unstrapped the precious cargo with practiced speed, cut the bell from its neck so it wouldn't cause confusion, and distributed the load among the other animals. The column barely even paused. They left the animal and continued their climb. The entire engagement, which would have ended the American mission, was reduced to a 2-minute delay. The Germans fired again, but it was too late. The mule train had passed the most exposed part of the trail. They were disappearing into a ravine, shielded by the mountain's own rock. The artillery officer, frustrated and confused, ordered his guns to cease fire. He had just been defeated. His high-tech 105mm cannons, the kings of the battlefield, had been beaten by a man with a bell and a deep understanding of animal psychology. The impossible path had been broken. High on the impossible peak, the Brazilian defenders were counting their last bullets. They were huddling in frozen foxholes, their hands numb, their stomachs empty. The radio was dying. The platoon lieutenant was preparing his men for the end, either a suicidal last stand or a shameful surrender. He had been told by command that resupply was impossible. He was a man on a dying island, and then, through the howl of the wind, he heard it. A sound so alien, so out of place, it felt like a hallucination. A bell. Clink, ... clink, ... clink. A sentry, his eyes scanning the ravine below, shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Mulas! Meu Deus! Some mulas!" The lieutenant crawled to the edge. Esta red dune. It was not a hallucination. There, walking calmly up the final, treacherous stretch of the path, was a line of mules, led by a single man. They weren't running. They weren't panicking. They were just walking, as if on a Sunday stroll. It was the Tropeiro. He reached the summit, his face a mask of calm determination caked in mud and snow. He didn't salute. He simply nodded to the stunned lieutenant. "Onde o senhor quer a munição?" Where do you want the ammunition? The men on the peak swarmed the animals, not as soldiers, but as survivors. They wept. They touched the mules. They hugged the Tropeiro. They were unloading not just boxers, but life itself. Fresh batteries for the radio, which crackled back to life, morphine and bandages for the wounded, and food, cans of rations, coffee, chocolate, and most importantly, belts of .30 caliber ammunition. The peak had been saved. The island was no longer sinking. Down at the command post, the American advisors, the ones who had read the manuals and declared the mission impossible, were listening to their radios in stunned silence. The first-hand reports were coming in from the lieutenant on the peak. "Supply train has arrived. All cargo delivered AM, ready to hold the position indefinitely." The Americans looked at their maps, at their logistical charts, at their failed reports. All their science, all their mechanization, all their standardized training had been proven wrong by one anonymous, backcountry Brazilian who knew how to talk to a mule. The Tropeiro's victory was not just a victory over the Germans, it was a victory over doctrine. It was the triumph of Gitaneo over the field manual. It proved that in war, especially in the brutal, unpredictable environment of the mountains, ancestral knowledge was more powerful than standardized logistics. The Americans had the best equipment in the world, but the Tropeiro had something they didn't: wisdom. He knew that the mountain demanded respect. He knew that an animal is not a machine. He knew that trust, not rope, is what keeps a column together. This was not a one-time miracle. This was a new system. The Brazilian High Command, seeing the undeniable proof, immediately changed their tactics. The American mule teams were respectfully sidelined. The Tropeiro and the men like him he had trained were placed in charge of all high-altitude logistics. The old Muleteer's Trick became the new, unofficial, and wildly successful doctrine for the entire Brazilian front. What was once an impossible route, a graveyard for animals, became a routine supply line, a Brazilian highway. The Tropeiros and their Bel-Ed teams became the lifeline of the Feb. Every night, under the cover of darkness, they would make the ascent. The clink, ... clink, ... clink of the madrinha's bell became the most beautiful sound in the Apennines. It was the sound of survival. It meant that the men on the peaks would have bullets for their rifles in the morning. It meant they would have coffee to warm their frozen hands. It meant they were not alone. The German artillery observers, who were still watching, still listening, were now completely baffled. They could still see the supply trains. They would still fire their artillery. But their barrages, which had once been so effective, were now useless. The mule trains would pause, the men would calm their animals, and the column would simply keep walking. The Germans were wasting thousands of rounds of ammunition on a target that refused to die. The Tropeiros had not just outsmarted the Americans, they had demoralized the Germans. They had turned the impossible into the routine. They, and their quiet, stubborn mules, had become the true masters of the mountain. And by doing so, they ensured the Brazilians could hold the high ground. De que the entire Goth Klein. Aqui está a parte 5 final do roteiro. Part 5, and then the spring of 1945 came. The snows melted. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, along with their allied partners, launched the final, massive offensive. They broke through the Gothic line. They poured down into the Po Valley. The War of Inches, fought on icy mountain peaks, suddenly became a war of miles, fought with tanks and trucks on flat, open roads. And just like that, the old Muleteer's Trick was no longer needed. The jeep, the truck, the tractor, the American doctrine of mechanization was king once again. The Tropeiros and their mules, who had been the single most critical element of the entire winter campaign, were quietly rotated to the rear. Their job was done. When the war in Italy ended just a few weeks later, on May 2nd, 1945, the story of the muleteers was already fading. It was a footnote. It was a local solution to a temporary problem. The Impossible Peak was just another name on a map. There was no official recognition for this. There was no medal for extraordinary mule handling. How do you write in a citation that a private, using a bell and burlap sacks, proved the entire Quartermaster Corps' doctrine wrong? How do you officially commend a man for ignoring regulations? You don't. The Army, especially one as organized as the American-led Allied force, doesn't celebrate its own failures. The reports were filed. The lesson was noted. In high-altitude terrain, local pack animal techniques are superior, and the incident was buried in an archive. The hack itself, the wisdom of the Tropeiro, was forgotten by the official record. The U.S. Army would go on to fight in Korea and Vietnam, where they would once again struggle with logistics in mountainous terrain, having to relearn the same brutal lessons that the Brazilian muleteers had solved with ancestral knowledge. Doctrine, once the war was over, had overwritten ingenuity. And what of the Tropeiro himself, the anonymous hero of the story? Like all the other Prasinis, he waited for a ship. He sailed home to Brazil. He landed in Rio de Janeiro, perhaps to a parade, perhaps to nothing at all. He mustered out of the army, receiving his discharge papers and a handshake. He took off his uniform for the last time. He put away his helmet, the one with the smoking cobra painted on the side. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't become a logistics consultant for the Brazilian army. He simply went home. He went back to Minas Gerais, or to Bahia, or to the dry hills of the He went back to his old life. He put his hand back on the harness of a mule. He went back to moving coffee, or corn, or tools, walking the same familiar mountain paths he had known since childhood. He lived a long, quiet, anonymous life. His neighbors knew him as Jonas or Antonio, the man who was good with animals. He probably told his children and grandchildren stories of a faraway place called Italia, of mountains so cold they burned your skin. He probably told them how he and his mule, Madrinha, had to carry food to his friends, all while bombs were falling. His grandchildren would have listened wide-eyed, seeing it as just another one of Vovo's amazing stories. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't. They couldn't know that for one desperate winter, this quiet old man, with his simple understanding of an animal's trust, held the fate of the entire Brazilian front in his weathered hands. He and his team of mules, walking calmly through artillery fire, were the single, beating heart of the FE. They were the artery that kept the fist on the mountain alive. He died, years later, as anonymously as he had lived. His obituary, if he had won, would have listed him as a farmer, a father, a good neighbor. It would not mention the Gothic line. It would not mention the American failure. It would not mention the sound of a bell that, for 6 months, was the sound of hope in a frozen hell. His story is not written in any official military history. It is written only in the legacy of the men who survived, that wintermen who lived, who came home, who had families of their own. All because one Tropeiro knew that you don't fight a mountain, and you never, ever fight a mule.